Welcome back to John Orford's Note. What's going to happen to global growth in 2013 is going to be of key concern to financial markets. 2012 saw lots of central bank action in the Eurozone and in the US, of course. With me to discuss global growth prospects is George Magnus, veteran economist and author. George, thank you for joining us. Our first chart, I've put together the IMF growth forecast for the advanced economies. What are you expecting? What's 2013 going to bring for Europe and the US?
These numbers, as depicted by the IMF, look pretty reasonable to me. I mean, I think that...
They look a bit shallow growth.
They're quite shallow. It may be that towards the second half of the year that things will look slightly feistier. I mean, the way I describe it, basically, the outlook for 2013 is I think the worst case outcomes that people were worried about probably won't happen, thanks to obviously, enormous monetary accommodation in the United States, in Japan, the Eurozone, probably in the UK with a new governor, and also because in some respects, at least in Europe, the structural drag from austerity will diminish. It won't go away, but it'll probably be less than in 2012.
So we nothing like the downturn we saw in 2009, but no great massive rebound such as we saw in after the 2009.
No, I don't think so. I think the cyclical outlook looks okay-ish for 2013, but what we're faced with fundamentally are structural problems, long-term adjustment, which central banks can kind of alleviate temporarily, but that would still worry me about the medium term. But I think 2013 we could wing it.
And the US leading the pack, boosting growth?
Yes, and I think the encouragement of the last few days about the possibility of avoiding the notorious fiscal cliff, actually I think is pretty good news, because actually away from the politics, the United States actually is starting to fill me personally with a little bit of optimism. Its competitive edge is coming back, the housing slump is over. They dealt with the banks forcefully and early, so they don't have the European kind of banking crisis. So it looks okay.
And the question for investors, is this going to be enough to trigger a big shift back into equities away from bonds?
Yeah, the big issue really is always how much the equity markets have already discounted. You could say a fair bit, but I think there's still some potential there, provided we don't get nasty shocks coming from either failure of politics or external, for example, nefarious things happening in the emerging world, for example.
Let's look at the emerging world. Actually, our second chart is the same thing, but the growth forecast for the emerging world. Of course, China, credited for saving the world in the past. Is China going to be contributing to that growth story in 2013?
Yes, I mean these lines obviously look pretty anemic relative to past performance of ever rising growth rates. And I think what the IMF is picking up here is really the tip of an iceberg, which is that many of these countries, and particularly these BRIC countries, in their own ways, actually are facing their own little tipping point. So it could be,
tipping point in the sense of.
Well, that their models are basically flawed, and therefore that they may be vulnerable to downside risks in terms of growth.
And commodity prices, a risk on commodity prices?
I think there is a bit of a risk for industrial rather than agricultural and soft commodity prices, which comes specifically from the fact that China's growth, whatever it is, whether it's 7% or 5%, which is where I think it's headed, is almost bound to be less commodity intensive than it has been for the last 5 or 10 years. And I think that's a big risk for commodity producers like Russia, for example, and Brazil to some extent, but not necessarily for commodity consumers like China and India itself.
The big phrase of 2012, of course, has been uncertainty and just not knowing what's going to happen next. Do you feel a little more certain, a little more confident going forward than you were perhaps 6 months ago?
I think I'm a little bit more confident. I'm a little bit hesitant about even using that phrase now, but a little bit more confident about the fact that the advanced economies could wing it through 2013. But I think there are growing risks actually for the models, the functioning of the economic models of some of the big emerging countries, including China, but also like India and Brazil.
George, thank you very much. So a little bit of an upbeat note to end 2012 then. A bit of confidence that 2013 might bring better growth. Nothing too exciting though.